John Mackey famously in his 1955 paper, Evil and Omnipotence, said there is a contradiction. So here are the claims that are in contradiction. God exists, God's omnipotent, God's perfectly good. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. A good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and there's evil. And it's true that those claims make a contradiction. But the problem is that those two claims, that an omnipotent being has no limits and that a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, neither of those claims is obviously true, and at least one of them is rejected by every theist.
All right, so hi, welcome back to Different Studios. My name is Elijah Antonet, and today we have Dr. Graham Oppy with us, professor at Monash University, with prior work at institutions like Melbourne as well as Princeton, most known for his work in philosophy of religion, specifically refuting popular theistic arguments as well as argument for atheism from simplicity, and your books like Arguing About Gods and Arguments for Atheism. And do you think there's anything to add on or where they can find your work?
I don't really want to add to the list of things that you've already said.
Okay, that's great.
I guess if you want to find papers, you can go to the website Phil Papers, which is a really good source for writings by philosophers, and lots of my stuff is there, but not the books. The books, publishers don't like them when the books turn up online for free, and so they keep taking them down. So some of the books are quite expensive. If you want them, you just have to, scour secondhand bookshops until you find them. Probably.
Okay. But today specifically, we're talking about the logical problem of evil. So for people who know me, this is my favorite topic. So I talk about this all the time. I'm talking about people in the community of philosophy. And so first to begin, what I know the logical problem of evil to be is that there's a logical contradiction with the property of God existing, evil existing, and God being omnipotent as well as omnibenevolent. And so first, I know you think that there are rational theists who could conceive of that possibility where there is God and there is evil. And so where do you think the logical problem of evil specifically goes wrong in terms of a rational person being able to believe otherwise?
Okay, so there's supposed to be a contradiction between something to do with evil, something to do with God's properties, right? And you put those things together and you get a contradiction. But as lots of people have noted, this is hard. You have to say exactly what the properties are. You have to say exactly what the claim about evil is. And then you need some more claims to actually get a contradiction. So, for example, John Mackey famously in his 1955 paper, Evil and Omnipotence, said there is a contradiction. So here are the claims that are in contradiction. God exists, God's omnipotent, God's perfectly good. There are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. A good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and there's evil. And it's true that those claims make a contradiction. If an omnipotent being has no limits and a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, then an omnipotent good being will eliminate evil entirely. And yet there's evil. And so you've got a contradiction. But the problem is that those two claims, that an omnipotent being has no limits and that a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, neither of those claims is obviously true, and at least one of them is rejected by every theist that I know. So you're not going to catch them out with that argument. Now you might think, well, the problem was that I just picked the wrong claims. Right? I got to add some different claims in there to make a good argument. But then the challenge is what to put in there. Notice that Mackey's argument, the contradiction was just that there's evil. But you can up the stakes a lot by making it that what's kind of in tension with God's properties is something like genocide, which happens a lot on the earth. Right? You can up the stakes, and then it might be much harder. Right, but if you're just taking it that the mere existence of evil is what's going to make a logical problem, I think you got your work cut out.
I agree. I think that the reformulation to which we account for like the scale of evil that we see rather than just evil simply creating a contradiction is a lot more powerful. But specifically what I've encountered to be the most powerful in my time is Plato's free will defense, specifically transcendental depravity, which I think like a lot of philosophers like William Lane Craig thinks does a well job of defeating the problem of evil. And so Plato's free will defense, if you could maybe tell them what it is instead of I doing it, and do you think it succeeds and where it doesn't? Maybe if you think it doesn't.
So um, the so there are different kinds of free will defenses that you can offer. And you can try and say that the reason why God permits moral evil, the reason why God permits certain kinds of bad actions to be carried out by people, like the people that carry out genocide, right, is to respect their free will, right? So to have free will worth having, there've got to be significant moral choices that need to be made. And so that's a way in which you can justify perhaps quite a lot of evil by appealing to free will. Difficulty with that as a theodicy is the suffering of animals, right? Um, it's not our fault. It's not the default. It's not the fault of any moral creatures that have ever lived on the earth that at the time of the dinosaurs there was a lot of animal suffering, right? So it just seems like the Odyssey of that kind is bound to be incomplete. No amount of appealing to free will is going to justify the suffering of mammals in the Jurassic. Right?
And so, uh, when I see theodicies like free will, or let's say soul making, right? It seems to me like this is
Yep.
what a conception that I came up when I first heard these theodicies. It seems like they try to give like contingent explanations for evil. They say this could come from evil, but given God's omnipotence and what it means to be omnipotent, meaning you can do all things logically possible, if God could bring about the outcome good without the evil in question, let's say he could bring about the greater good of free will or soul making without evil in a logically possible world, then it seems like he would. And so it seems to me that the Odysseys that give contingent explanations fail in every regard. Do you think that line of reasoning fails when it comes to the Odysseys?
So I think that it's quite hard to find plausible theodicies for some things. It's pretty hard to find plausible theodicy for genocide, really. And it's very hard to find a plausible theodicy for animal suffering. There's been quite a lot of work done by theistic philosophers in the last decade or so, wrestling with the problem of finding theodicies for animal suffering. My own view is that theists do better if they don't offer theodicy. Instead, they do something like this. They say, there is an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God. Because God's omnipotent, omniscient, we have no insight into the reasons that God has for doing things. In particular, there's no really good reason why we should be able to figure out why God permits the evils that he does, but no doubt he's got reasons. So that's not offering a theodicy. I didn't tell you what God's reasons are. The person who offers a theodicy is claiming to know what God's reasons are. Instead, it's a response that's meant to undercut the argument from evil in whatever version you're putting it forwards, because you must, in order to think that there's some problem that arises with, if you think that God exists and that there's evil or evil of certain kinds or whatever, you must be making certain assumptions about divine psychology when you're doing that, and no assumptions about divine psychology are justified on this way of responding to the problem of evil. Note that there's a cost for theists in doing this, which is that any positive argument that appeals to divine psychology is undercut at the same time. And so, for example, you just lose fine-tuning arguments and cosmological arguments, a whole lot of things just disappear along with it. But you might think that that's a price worth paying. It depends what your goal is in the dialectic that you're having.
And that's a concession I don't think the theist wants to give. But regarding what you initially said, that seems to me like skeptical theism, where you're unaware of the reasons that God could have, but you don't really say anything about it. Do you think things like that, where they seem to be skeptical on what God could have or have normative reasons, that falls into like maybe a greater skeptical view, like moral decay or things where they can't even evaluate simple moral propositions in that case?
So I've certainly worried about that. I've written papers where I've argued that that's a potential problem for skeptical theists. But there's a certain kind of skeptical theist who will say, we know some things because God's told us, right? So you have religious tradition, you have scripture, you have religious experience. People claim that God talks to them. There's all kinds of stuff that you might have. And what you're skeptical about is you're being able to get knowledge of God through other means other than by right. And so it's not necessarily going to be the case that you fall into these problems, skepticism about ordinary morality, because you might think that God's told us, depending on your tradition. You might think that it's written down in certain books, or you might think that God kind of actually tells you, there's this little voice inside your head that's God telling you not to do things, or whatever the story is. So it's not completely obvious that that if you take the skeptical theist approach, you're going to run into a problem of the kind that you mentioned. But there are other problems about how good appeals, how epistemically good appeals to scripture or tradition or revelation and so on actually are. And so there's a different discussion to be had about that.
Okay, and so I'm familiar with the problems that come from divine command theory concerning metaethics, but I think it's a different discussion. But at this point in time, given like the theodicies that you think don't do as well, but the skeptical theist route that does particularly more well, do you think the evidential problem is stronger than the logical one when it comes to persuading a rational person?
So the thing about the evidential arguments is that they're almost certainly going to be making appeals to divine psychology, right? And so they'll be vulnerable to that kind of objection. If you're running a logical argument, you're just saying there's a contradiction in the theist views. The only thing you need is that there are theists that committed to all the claims that are logically contradictory, and then you've got a good argument. But if the theists don't accept the claims, then you don't have a good argument, because the argument just passes them by. So I think that when it comes to logical arguments, it's an open question whether there's a good one, right? Because, I mean, all the ones that we've come up with so far have turned out to miss the mark, in my view. I mean, there are some people who disagree. Michael Tooley is one person. There's a couple of others who are still running really complicated logical arguments. But I think that it always turns out that there's some premises that lots of theists just say, no, I don't accept that. And once you say that, the logical argument it's all over for that logical argument. I'm less sanguine about the prospects of making any good evidential argument, just because I think that I'm inclined to take seriously the kind of skeptical theist response, and I think that it's hard to see how to make evidential arguments that avoid that response.
Okay, and so you've been on record saying that you don't think there are pertinently successful arguments for theism or for atheism. And so, given this is an argument for atheism, the logical problem of evil, you would hold the position that it isn't successful. But what do you mean by successful here? Because I don't think you're using it in the way that most people would think, as in it's sound, but maybe in relation to rational persuasion.
So suppose you've got a theory. Just think of a theory as a whole lot of claims. Think of your beliefs, that everything that you believe, that's your kind of total theory. Now, suppose that you've got a consistent theory. right? Now that might be a big supposition, but we can maybe carve away the inconsistencies from the views that you've got. And then within that, let's just pick out everything that's relevant to debates in philosophy of religion, all your beliefs. So that, and think of that as your theory about religion, right?
Okay.
Given your theory, there'll be infinitely many sound arguments that have as its conclusion whatever, that God exists or that God doesn't exist, depending upon what you believe. By your lights, that is, by your lights, they'll be sound, because you just rely on your theory to tell you which of the premises are true. And so long as the argument's got premises that you think are true, and the conclusion follows. And I'm just going to skate over that bit. We'll just talk about valid arguments. We'll ignore the invalid ones.
Mm-hmm.
You'll think there's a sound argument. So sound arguments are really easy. God doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. That's a sound argument, right? By my lights, because I don't think that God exists, right? Either God exists or, either God doesn't exist or 2 and 2 are 4. Sorry, is that what I want to say? Or 2 and 2 are 5. Either God doesn't exist or 2 and 2 are 5, but 2 and 2 are not 5, so God doesn't exist. Right? We can go on constructing sound arguments forever, right? It doesn't mean anything, in my opinion. Right? Every view has an infinite array of what, by its lights, are sound arguments available to it. So whatever your criterion for the success of arguments is, it can't just be soundness. Right?
Mm-hmm. And so,
right, so that's the point of this, right? It can't be soundness. Soundness is too easy. Soundness by your lights is just too easy.
I guess maybe this is like touching into maybe like meta-ontology, something weird like that. But I do agree that just valid sound arguments don't give you a conclusion about what exists, because these are things that, like by your lights as well, are either sound or not sound. But I like to ask this question as well as maybe towards the end of discussion. But in your time when you have when you've been studying philosophy, when has there been a point where you genuinely changed the philosophical position that you've held beforehand you didn't think you would concede? Because I've encountered many people in the debate sphere of philosophy as well as intellectuals, and they usually keep the same positions their whole life, or when they start and when they end reading philosophy. But has there been any point when you've changed? Because for me, there has.
So I changed my mind about lots of things. And I'll talk about post-PhD, because there's even more flip-flopping while I'm learning just elementary things in philosophy. But even post-PhD, there's lots of things that I've changed my mind about. So to take one example, I was very influenced by my advisors, David Lewis and Gil Harman. And so Lewis in particular, I was very influenced by his view about possible worlds. And it's not that I was a modal realist, but I thought that in his fashion, but for a long time, I thought that the right way to think about possibility was in terms of conceivability, roughly, or some sort of idealized notion of conceivability. And that was metaphysical possibility. I'm not talking about epistemic possibility. I'm talking about something ontological. And eventually I came to think that that was just wrong. The right way to think about metaphysical possibility gives you a much smaller range of possibilities than this sort of idealized conceivability gives you. So I think, for example, that I've come to think that if there's such a thing as laws of nature, then the laws of nature are necessary. They hold in every metaphysically possible world. Whereas on the conceivability view, it seems like you can conceive of the laws of nature being different in all kinds of ways. So that's one thing amongst many that I changed my mind about eventually. It wasn't like there was a kind of road to Damascus moment where it suddenly clicked. It's just that over time I've been thinking about this stuff, and eventually I realised that my views had shifted and that I no longer accepted the conceivability view, and I had a different, more Aristotelian view of modality, metaphysical modality.
Mm-hmm. And that's always a tricky thing, metaphysical modality, when it's brought up in discussions, because there doesn't seem to be a consensus like there is for logical possibility or things like non-logical possibility. But Uh, Regarding the problem of evil specifically, uh, given that we aren't sure there's a nuanced position currently, do you think down the line, I mean, this is pretty opaque because in physics, you could say, we know down the line there's going to be some new argument or something like that. But do you think there's going to be a successful argument for theism or atheism, maybe in your lifetime or progressively after?
So is that specifically a successful argument from evil against theism, or just arguments generally for and against?
Well, I guess both, because I want to get both.
Yeah, right. So I think that as things stand, there's just no reason to think that there's a kind of killer argument in the offing, which would be such that everybody, no matter where they started from, just said, "Yep, it's game over." That view, whatever it is, naturalism, theism, whatever it is, just has to be right. I don't think there's any chance of an argument like that coming along. I think that you should be, I mean, if you were hoping that something like that might happen, I think that you should make a rather pessimistic induction from the history of philosophy, from the origins of philosophy up until now. Arguments settle almost nothing in philosophy. When they do settle things, what they settle stops being philosophy, right, and becomes something else, logic or physics or whatever. So I don't think that there's, so I think that there's, that in the case of religious questions and in some other cases as well, including lots of other areas in philosophy, there's just no prospect of arguments that are just going to settle differences of opinion. That's my view.
Okay, and so given we know these things about like arguments for that, like validity doesn't actually show that something is a rational position. Where does sufficient evidence come into account? Because I know when people say they don't take validity to be a way to demonstrate existence or non-existence, would then evidence take over? And so, and I'm not saying specifically the evidential argument, but let's say like evidence even for theism, like fine tuning, would you then replace it with evidence to then be the ultimate decider of what's rational or what's not rational, given that you can be in your own light valid or sound?
So I guess like there might be evidence and you don't know about it, right? And it might be the case that some people think something's evidence and you don't, right? So a good example of that would be people who think that what's written in the Gospels is evidence for the resurrection, right? And so they think that there's actually evidence for the resurrection, whereas I think that the kind of prior questions that you have to ask are about the production of those texts, why we should think that anything that's written in the text is trustworthy, and a whole lot of questions like that undermine the idea that you can just say, well, it's written in the text, so that's evidence, right? There's the possibility of those kinds of disputes about what's evidence, right? Ideally, I think the way to resolve that question, if you've got two people coming up against one another, is to say, we'll take as evidence just the stuff that we agree on. Everything else is theory, right? So it's part of their theory that the Gospels are evidence for the resurrection, but it ain't part of the evidence if I'm arguing with a person like that.
Yeah, it's like this epistemic disagreement. I read some text on it, but I like how they started as like a problem of evil discussion, and it came to like some like epistemic discussion about what's a rational belief. But to end things off, because I don't want to take too much of your time, because I told you it'd be 20 to 25 minutes. For someone who's getting into philosophy like myself, I started maybe a year ago, just purely studying philosophy of religion. It's the only thing I like to do, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from you on different arguments, like the cosmological argument. Is the goal to learning the most, and I guess just becoming as well refined in your positions, just staying curious and reading more, because that's what I'm trying to do. But is there anything you'd like give it as advice for someone who wants to get into philosophy as a serious thing?
So I think that you've kind of nailed it, really. Stay curious, read widely. There's lots of different areas of philosophy and lots of disciplines outside of philosophy that become relevant when you start thinking about the full range of arguments against or for the existence of God. So cosmological arguments, cosmology, same for fine tuning. But when it comes to assessing the extent to which ancient texts can be treated as sources of evidence, then there's history. I mean, there's the work that serious historians outside of those who do the history, who study the history of religion from a religious point of view, but how historians actually read and interpret historical texts broadly, historical documents, that kind of stuff. There's just so many different things that you want to know something about. So you have to be curious and read lots. So I 100% I agree with what you said.
All right, thank you. And I think that's going to wrap it up for us. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you, Dr. Oppy. It's been a pleasure. Bye.